Good evening and welcome. This is a special occasion. It's our first Central Library online event ever, and the first one then in 2021. My name is Brenda Cogan. I'm here from the Central Library and you're all very, very welcome. We have a special guest this evening, Dr. Mary Muldowney, who, as many of you will know, is the Dublin City Council Central Area Historian in Residence. And judging by the popularity of today's talk, I think that we are very honoured that she's here with us. The topic that Mary has chosen for tonight is Retail in Dublin City Centre, 1790 to 1990, an introduction to the series. And before Mary starts, if I could just ask you to mute your audio, and afterwards Mary is very happy to take questions, and we might do that with the chat function, and we're also recording it so we can put it on the website. So it's over to you now, Mary.
Thanks, Bernadette. I've been admitting people while you were talking, so in case you're wondering where all the numbers have come from. Sorry, I just want to lose my things to my messages to myself because Bernadette is doing all the hard work here in the background. Good evening, and you need to put me onto the speaker view. Yeah, so I'm not hidden from view.
Okay. New speaker view.
Yeah, that's the blue one.
Blue one, yeah.
Yeah. So as I'm now the active speaker, actually, do you know what I'm going to do, Bernadette? So there we are.
Yeah.
Just to be friendly, I don't really like looking at myself on the screen, to be honest. So, but because we're kicking off, as she said, on this auspicious occasion of doing the first Central Library online, I seem to spend a lot of my time on Zoom these days, and I've actually been talking most of the day, so I do hope that my voice will survive. Anyway, delighted to see so many people turning up, and I'm going to try and keep this short by my standards, which is about half an hour to 35-40 minutes at most, so we can have plenty of time for discussion at the end. And this is the first of a series that I've planned to do with the Central Library. So roughly once a month or so, we will have, I give a lecture like this. This is the introduction to the series. It will be about retail shopping in Dublin city centre and looking at it mainly for the 18th, 19th, well actually the 19th and 20th century to be realistic, because I'm a bit lazy. If I take on the 18th as well, I'll be here forever. So what I will be looking at will be the area around Dublin 1, because that's where the Central Library is situated. And I'm going to be, Bernadette, sorry, I'm admitting people. It seems to be coming up on mine as host rather than you. You can hit the admit all button, which will let everybody in at once. Sorry, excuse me, this is distracting. So we're going to be looking at the shape of the city centre and how it's changed, especially around shopping and retail. And one of the things that has fascinated me over years as primarily a labour historian is how workplaces have shaped the areas around them. And that's just as true for the inner city as it is for any other part of Dublin. So looking at the shops and the traders that have worked on certain streets and how they've changed over the years reflects how the city has changed as well, and it can tell you something about the social history of the place. So This evening, I will be focusing primarily on, sorry, I'm just again trying to shut this off so it's not distracting me, excuse me. But I'll be looking at the history of O'Connell Street, formerly Sackville Street, as you can see here, and before that, Drogheda Street. And in future talks, I'm going to explore some of the streets that link to O'Connell Street as we know it now.
Excuse me, Mary, but somebody has a television or a radio on and it's very distracting.
Okay. Well, the audience, can you see where the mute button is on your screen and press it? Thanks, Margaret, so that, it is, it quite often is hard to blank out that background noise. Still going there. Whoever it is, could you please?
Yeah, I think you can, like yourself, you can mute everybody else. Like, well, maybe
you can mute all.
Yeah, you can mute.
I can't from my screen, but Bernadette, if you could do it from yours.
I'm going to see, yeah.
And then if it mutes me as well, I'll unmute myself.
It's just under the participant list.
Yeah.
Can
you see it?
It's not giving me that option at the moment.
Maybe
I'll try it here.
Is the one that's not muted.
I tell you what.
I'll go through the list.
It's okay. I've done it.
Yeah.
So, and I'm admitting a few more people. So coming back to what
Sorry, speaker, you're on mute now as well, Mary. You're on mute.
So I will be looking at Henry Street in the next talk next month, and the Earl Street and Abbey Street and the various retail businesses that were on those. And some of the future talks I intend to devote to specific businesses. So Cleary's is an obvious one, particularly since it will be reopening and repurposed. And Arnott's, couple of others like that. So businesses that were there, were thriving for many years and now sadly have gone. And also the nature of the businesses and the goods that were being sold and what that says about the way the city has changed as well. So you might be thinking when I'm describing this, well, what about Southside and Grafton Street and all the posh shops? Well, the Central Library is in the middle of Dublin 1, and that's what I'm focusing on. Plus, I'm a proud Northsider, so I didn't take very much persuasion. Okay, so wait, let's see, can I just move on? As I said, this is being hosted by the Central Library, and the future talks will be as well. I may well have met some of you at talks in the Central Library in the meeting room there, and I just hope that with all my heart that we can be back there sooner rather than later. The one advantage of Zoom is, of course, that you can reach out a lot further geographically and in terms of numbers, but it's so much nicer to see people sitting there in front of you. So the activity of shopping goes back actually many thousands of years, but the first currency and the use of money in shopping emerged about 3,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. And the evolution of currency accompanied developments in the creation of markets. So where you had basic barter changing to having markets in maybe the center of towns and villages, and then stalls being set up and considerable more development that looked something like the modern day shop as we would know it. And people started to use these marketing centres for socialising as well as actually exchanging goods and their money as it became more involved in the process. So it became kind of logical that around marketing centres, that centres of governance and administration for cities and towns and even more wider areas would develop as well. So I'm not going to go back that far with the history of O'Connell Street, but it was connected in many ways to that sort of occupation in the city of Dublin. So if we leap forward a few thousand years from Mesopotamia 3,000 years ago, which is quite a leap even in historical terms, we find ourselves in the middle of 18th century Dublin. And at the time, the city was experiencing considerable prosperity because it was the seat of what we now refer to as the Grattan Parliament, the Parliament of Ireland. And of course, when you're at the centre of government, prosperity, commerce, all of those things tend to go along with it. And Dublin was no exception. And ambitious plans were being formulated by the local authorities and the national authorities to reshape what was a medieval city in Dublin, the old centre around here, and create a more modern thoroughfare of streets that would be suitable for commerce, but also would be much more in a European style and would be more in keeping with the kind of vision that was going with having our own parliament here in what was then now the beautiful Bank of Ireland on College Green, but was the Parliament building. So the Wide Streets Commissioners were appointed in the middle of the 18th century, and these are the main streets and you might recognise some of them. Here's the river, and then of course we're going up around the Gardner estates and Mountjoy and what's now Parnell Square and, that sort of area. And of course, the nice long thoroughfare that was represented by Sackville Street, which is here, and all the rest is the south side, which I'm just broadly dismissing here. But the idea was that they would be very focused on developing not just wide streets, that was a shorthand, but that they would build elegant new houses that would be relatively uniform in the approach so that you would have a nice, elegant kind of profile, the Georgian houses as we know them. And provision in these streets was made for shops where people, the residents of the houses and their servants could buy whatever they needed without having to travel too far from their homes. So Luke Gardner, who we know because of Gardner Street and all of the development that he did in that area. He lived from 1690 to 1755, and he was a highly successful banker, developer, and member of Parliament, which was a very useful combination to have in the 18th century. And I wouldn't like to suggest that there was corruption involved, but the fact that he was a banker who was able to call on local authorities to back his development plans probably didn't do him any harm at all, although he did actually end up with leaving enormous debts to his son. But his grandson, who was also Luke Gardner, came along later and was able to resolve all of that. However, he had been buying up properties for most of his period as a member of Parliament, and most of what he bought was from the Moore family, which we will see was connected to Moore Street, but that piece of land in the east and northeast end of the city eventually became what we know as Sackville Street. He called it after the first Duke of Dorset, who happened to be a friend of his, but was also involved with the development. And so that's where the names, I think his name was Lionel Sackville, and he his name was applied to the street, but also this area here, which became also known as Sackville Mall and was enclosed at one point in the 18th century, so that it was a pedestrian zone and must have been very elegant to look at, but then they had to admit traffic. So the Wide Streets Commissioners, or to give them their full title, the Commissioners for Making Wide and Convenient Ways, Streets and Passages in the City of Dublin, was established in 1757 by Act of Parliament. And it was one of the earliest town planning authorities in Europe. It was quite ahead of its time. And the authority was given to the Commission to acquire property by compulsory purchase. And the idea was that from doing this, then they would be able to demolish some of the old medieval style buildings and create these broad thoroughfares and boulevards. And they could lay down new streets and set lots along the new streets by way of building leases that were then in turn issued to developers. So especially in the upper end of the street, what you have originally, around the second half of the 18th century would have been large, in some cases actual mansions, but certainly very large, elegant buildings, very few of them. I think there's only one left really at this stage. Excuse me. But, there was this plan, which this is one of, I think, Thomas Sherrod's drawings. He was one of the architects involved in that original planning. Now, this is for Westmoreland Street, but you can see the uniformity that it's not boring, it's elegant. And of course, all of the shops, as we'll see in later pictures, it would have been possible to have awnings over them so that, they could be quite cheerful in the summer and even protect you from the rain. At some stage, you will be able to go back into the city archives in the Gilbert Library in Pearse Street and examine these for yourselves. The collection is amazing, and I always think it's quite magical to be able to see the original documents. I just noticed I had a prompt to unmute. I hope I haven't been muted.
No, you're okay.
That's all right, everybody can hear. So the Commission has significant power, and they certainly used it to regulate the facades of the buildings so that you have this lovely, really appealing, elegant look that still exists around parts of Mountjoy Square and Parnell Square and what's left of that part of O'Connell Street. Lower O'Connell Street was slightly more commercial in approach, so it's maybe survived a little bit better for that reason. Now, they could even dictate the size of the windows. So, if you stand back and there is a perspective, and I know there's an architectural term for this, which I confess I've forgotten, but the materials were dictated by the commissioners, but what they did leave to the choice of the various developers who took up the leases was the choice of the, things like the, I've kind of forgotten the name of the window that goes over the door, but it meant that you could allow a differentiation there. So that's often where you're looking at a Georgian streetscape and you see some kind of individuality coming in. Now, a few years after the Wide Street Commissioners were starting their work, they had commissioned this design for Carlisle Bridge, which was what we now know as O'Connell Bridge. And the reason for having a bridge at the end of Sackville Street was to connect with Dame Street and that broad thoroughfare up to the centre of government. Now, because the north side of the city was relatively isolated from the south side at that point, there were bridges further on down the river, but not coming into what was seen now to be the premier commercial centre. So the bridge was opened in 1795, and it also linked the south side to the north side of the quays, which was where ships were still able to come right up to what's now O'Connell Bridge. You know, that the port was a lot more close to the city centre then than it would be now. The bridge was designed by James Gandon, who's so well known for his other work, including the Custom House just down the way from the bridge, and of course the forecourts and various others, including King's Inns. It was initially opened only to pedestrians in 1792, but in 1795, when they did open it to traffic, it did establish the commercial success of Sackville Street, and all of these two sides of lower Sackville Street were totally occupied in terms of commercial leases. So, it meant you didn't have empty buildings or empty shops. From 1800 onwards, the Wide Streets Commission adopted a supervisory role only in the development of Dublin. They were no longer initiating major restructuring as has been done in the second half of the previous century. But with the successful establishment of Dublin City Council under the Municipal Corporations Act, the power was given to the council to make the sorts of decisions about structure and development that had been made by the Wide Streets Commissioners. And the commission itself then was abolished under the Act for what was it called, the Dublin Improvement Act, when it was felt that there was no longer any need for them because the council was taking over from 1851. Now, I'm going to keep referring to Dublin City Council for convenience, partly because it's very complicated looking at when they went from council to corporation and back again, and it's not kind of the key thing of what I want to talk about this evening. So, as I said, the importance of Sackville Street had been established, and this was really underlined by the opening of the General Post Office in 1814. It's an absolutely, this is a postcard from 1865, but you can see that many of the lines of the buildings that we still enjoy, because it was restored after 1916, were there. Now, historian Peter Pearson described it as really combining the prestige and power of An Post, RTE, and all the telephone communications companies put together. That's what he said about 10, 15 years ago. And, that would have been, the Post was one of the most important commercial developments with business across the world, never mind in Ireland. So, Francis Johnson's design reflects how seriously the business of the post office was being taken. So you might well ask, where was the shopping going on in all of this? And normally, when I was, thinking of how I would normally do research for this kind of talk, I'd have been straight down to the Gilbert Library and looked at the full set of Tom's directories that they have there, and getting totally distracted from whatever I went to research, but enjoying myself immensely. Obviously, the archives, the reading room was closed, so I had to rely on the internet. And thankfully I did find one alternative anyway. It was a transcription of the 1862 Tom's Directory at the entry for Sackville Street. It was on an American genealogical site, and I just came across it by accident. But what I've done is give you an indication of some of the businesses that were being shown in the directory at that stage. And it's fascinating, at least I find it fascinating anyway, because there's a certain element of continuity with some of the businesses. Sackville Street was quite famous in the 19th century for the jewellers. There were a lot of jewellers' shops, particularly in the first half, not so much showing here. Though, as I said, this is just an indicative selection. It was obviously very many businesses. But what you see were Bewley and Evans, apothecaries and chemists, and this is a frequent thing, you know, there's somebody, a business advertising itself as by appointment to the Queen, Victoria, and the Lord Lieutenant, who I can't remember would have been at the time, but, you know, we were still being thoroughly ruled by Britain at this stage. But if you look at Wright and Oxley, military outfitters and uniform makers, tailors, were doing a thriving business on O'Connell Street at this stage. And I have to say, my recollection of looking at Tom's directories for Henry Street over a number of years, that was another great source of dressmaking, uniform making, tailoring, all of those things. But I'll come back to that in the specific lecture on that. If you look here at Alvarez in number 46. Now, I don't know if they were ancestors of the Alvarez who run the sports shop, but because I couldn't get access to later copies of Tom's to kind of, one of the great things about using Tom's is that you can follow businesses and families, because at this stage especially, business owners often gave their personal addresses and details about their connections, so you can trace them through decades if you choose. Sorry, I didn't mean to move past that yet. Anyway, I had to use Dr. Google to see what a gutta percha is. And I should have realized, or well, you know, actually, I'm not beating myself up about it that I didn't get it, but the waterproofing is the clue. Gutta percha is a rubber product from trees imported from Sri Lanka and India and countries around there. And it was used to make waterproof garments and shoes and various things in the 19th century. In the 21st century, its almost sole use is in the treatment of root canal problems. So it's narrowed down very significantly, but it's just such a glorious word. You can see others, you know, it wasn't all retail businesses. For instance, the Hibernian Bible Society, and you have the Friendly Brothers Club, who were for many years up in Stephen's Green, so I don't again know when they went up there. You've got these would have been in I should have said, this is lower Sackville Street, the buildings from this side, and this side are from the upper end. And where you notice that there may be educational institutions or some kind of an institution of some description, for instance, like the Dorset Institute for Industrious Females, who covered all sorts of things, including the repository for all sorts of plain work. Not entirely sure, again, what that might mean. But these are in, I would imagine, rooms that have been divided up as offices in some of the older, more spacious buildings at the top of the upper end of the street. And that is where you saw that kind of business rather more than the smaller ones. But then if you're looking at number 49 in Lower Sackville Street here, you've got Lemons, who I don't know that they're still going strong necessarily, and of course they're no longer necessarily manufacturers to the Queen. But my colleague for the Northwest area, Cormac Moore, does terrific talk on lemon sweets and has written a great chapter for one of our volumes of History on Your Doorstep. But these are just an indication of the range. I love the idea of Professor Luckman. I'm not entirely sure that he was a professor, because it seems a bit unlikely when he's describing himself as a photographic institution, but then, you know, I could be totally wrong. And he was a portrait publisher. This is just a kind of, I suppose, flash in time for the street and the retail activity and the other kinds of activity. This, by the way, McSweeney's became known as Delaney's New Mart, and this was one of the first purpose-built department stores in, not just in Ireland, but in the world. And it was bought by Cleary's at a later stage, but I'm not going to go into it now because that is something I will cover in the lecture and the talk on the history of Cleary's. But you can see the range of goods they were selling, which is the clue to them, you know, needing quite that many buildings to occupy. But what was also there as part of it, next door and right next door, would have been W.H. Smith, who of course are still thriving in Britain and Northern Ireland, but I don't know that they have any shops in the Republic anymore. But the nice connection here is Charles Eason as the manager in 1862. And a few years later, Eason himself had bought up premises on Abbey Street. He did this in 1856, set up his own company, and by 1887 had moved into Sackville Street, where they still are on O'Connell Street, but of course having expanded significantly on the site, but also literally all around Dublin and, you know, with branches all around the country. As I said, the shops on Lower Sackville Street had been purpose designed as shops, and you can see there's a certain uniformity. You can just see the upper floor there, but also of the ground floor, and that, you know, and size. It looks like Thomas Sherritt's original drawings. And of course the horse-drawn cabs and trams that were still there. So they contrasted somewhat with the townhouses and the elegant residences at the upper end of the street. But as the 19th century progressed and the Wide Streets Commission's original plan of uniformity began to change, this was because many of the buildings were amalgamated and repurposed. For instance, early in the 19th century, the three buildings at, I think there were number 21, 22 and 23 Upper O'Connell Street, where the Gresham became the tenants, the owners, the three buildings were put together to create the hotel. And of course, as I said, Delaney's New Mart became one of the first purpose-built department stores. But you can see in this one, the Hotel Metropole. I'm afraid it's rather a fuzzy picture because I think it's been kind of pixelated slightly because I probably shouldn't really have it. I tend to, use first and ask later. But because it's not for profit, I'm sure there will be no difficulty about it with the Historical Picture Archive. Anyway, looking at the Hotel Metropole there, it was a very sumptuous building, and it became known all over the place for, not just in Ireland, but in Britain and Europe, for the luxury of its appointments, but also for its ballroom, which was still operating right up until the 1950s. But by the beginning of the 20th century, the street was full of hotels. And of course, a lot of it was due to the development of trains and the tram lines through the city. This street was now recognised as kind of Main Street Ireland as well as Main Street Dublin. And this was reflected not just in the high-end hotels, but in well-appointed firms like Gilbey's Wine Merchants and Alex Findlater's, who had branches elsewhere. I couldn't find an older photograph of Findlater's, but since they disappeared later on in the century, that one kind of will remind some people of when they were there. Gilbey's was one of the original very stunning style buildings, but it was knocked down in 1973 to make way for an office block, which I think is occupied at the moment by Dublin City Council. So I shouldn't probably say too much about it. But what did make a big difference to the footfall in O'Connell Street, and of course the occupation in the hotels and the restaurants, was the fact that those trams were coming right through O'Connell Street, and a lot of them converged around Nelson's Pillar. So by the early 20th century, the character of the street had changed because cinemas and theatres were opening up, and really all through Sackville Street you had cafes and ice cream parlours and less salubrious eating establishments. And at this stage, the street began to be called O'Connell Street, especially by nationalists. And this was mainly because of the O'Connell statue being erected. It was conceived by John Henry Foley in 1866. He was commissioned to design it. And then I think it was completed by Thomas Brock because it's bronze, and it was, he finished the casting. But there were many moves within the City Council to change the name formally, but it actually wasn't until after independence that it was changed in 1924. And the street, sadly, on 31st of August 1913 was the scene of really vicious violence when fairly drunken members, from reports at the time of the Dublin Metropolitan Police, attacked members of the public and striking workers who had been locked out under the Great Dublin Lockout in 1913. They were attacked by the police when they had gathered opposite the Imperial Hotel, which I'll come back to as well because it was part of Cleary's building. He had appeared on a balcony to speak to the crowd, and the police lost the run of themselves, and 2 of the strikers were killed, and up to 300 people were badly hurt, and of course there were many arrests. But I don't know whether you could see that Larkin kind of got his revenge in a sense, because Oisin Kelly's fabulous, I think, inspiring statue is now facing Cleary's building in O'Connell Street and reminding everybody that at the end of the day, you can't keep good workers down. So it's probably, though, more frequently that the events of the 1916 Rising are associated with what was still being called Sackville Street officially. Pearse read out the proclamation on the steps of the GPO, and of course, as we know, there was considerable looting, death and destruction in much of the city in the course of the rising. Far more civilians killed than soldiers on either side. Unfortunately, the rebels had mistakenly assumed that the British wouldn't shell the centres of administration and commerce around the city centre. And as you can see, the destruction here, and of course in many other photographs from the time, they were unfortunately very wrong. So looking from Carlisle Bridge here, this into Westmoreland Street, you see the extent of the damage because the gunship Helga came up the river and literally bombarded the city buildings. So the South Quays were not as badly damaged because the Helga was pointing northwards, partly because they were aiming at Liberty Hall in the mistaken understanding that because the Irish Citizen Army had come from there, that was a kind of a headquarters for the rebels. But one witness statement at the time described the windows, the plate glass windows in Cleary's, literally melting from the heat of some of the bombardment. So there was quite a lot of damage, but what the lower part on the other side hadn't been so bad, but that got its own share of damage later on then during the Battle of Dublin during the Civil War. But the plans to restore the buildings were actually implemented very quickly. And there was an agreement that as far as possible, what they would do would go back to the original concept of a single harmonious design and use stone facades throughout the street in that broadly classical style that had been the original Wide Streets commissioner's idea. And the common feature of all the buildings that were restored and re-erected at that stage was a ground first and second floor. This would actually be ground and first floor in Irish terms, and then a uniformity reflecting this with the windows being similar as well. So when you're looking at Cleary's and Eason's, which were restored almost within a year or two of the 16 Rising, it's not reflective. It took a few years for most of it to be put back. It was sort of the mid-1920s, but Horace O'Rourke, who was the city architect until 1944, in fact, he insisted on the agreement being implemented of keeping that kind of fairly uniform facade, which you can see up here at the far side of O'Connell Street. This is moving forward a little bit. The Gresham Hotel had been restored and the Savoy Cinema had been completed by this stage. And of course, the GPO was one of the first buildings that under independence was restored, almost identical to what had been there before. But this is one of the more significant developments in O'Connell Street. We're jumping up to 1966 in this point, and the demolition of Nelson's Pillar. There had been various suggestions over the previous 100 years or so that the council should get rid of Nelson, that he was anathema to the city of Dublin. There wasn't really that strong of a feeling, really, but in 1966 anyway, anyone driving through the city centre on the morning of the 8th of March discovered that suddenly the whole streetscape had changed, and it hadn't been possible to do anything about it because the pillar was owned by, it was a private enterprise and the council couldn't interfere with it. But historian Joseph Brady suggested that the attack in the early hours actually forced the council to take action that they would have preferred not to. And he described the official response saying it was interesting the speed with which the authorities moved to decide that the monument was to be demolished, with the focus that had never been evident in the previous hundreds or so years, nor was evident in many other cases. It was decided within days not to rebuild, but rather to demolish. And by the way, anyone interested in the history and development of Dublin in the 20th century, I cannot recommend too highly Joseph Brady's book, which you can borrow from the City Library. I forgot to check if it's available on BorrowBox, but hopefully when the library's open again, you will all go in and get your own copies. So it was one of the reasons that had been given by the council for not removing the pillar was traffic, that it would be too disruptive to do the work, where others were arguing that it was an obstruction in the middle of the street. But these, if you look at these photographs from a little later on, especially around O'Connell Bridge, this is O'Connell Street, running down towards O'Connell Bridge, and of course down Bachelor's Walk and to the Aston Quay and various others there. You might notice that the traffic is going in a completely opposite direction to how we would see it now. There are no traffic lights and there are incredibly few road markings. I'm not sure if there are any at all. I think that might be meant to be a double yellow line. But there began to be a growing obsession with traffic from the 1970s on. And as the number of cars on the streets kept increasing. So the removal of Nelson's pillar, and this was where it was described by the former journalist and the environmental writer Frank MacDonald as a decline in character and the overall cohesion of the area. It had been a great visiting point and people would meet up there. So he describes in his book, I think it's called The Destruction of Dublin, can't remember the exact title, but the destruction of many of the iconic buildings along the street, because he said what was put in instead didn't really fit the original concept of this kind of metropolitan boulevard. Another change began to be the replacement of some of the older buildings with new British high street stores and more international stores, which not just eventually changed the face of Dublin shopping, but towns, suburban villages and other cities around the country. Bernadette, I'm going to hurry up. I know I'm running over time. So unfortunately, the beautiful Metropole was replaced by this building, which is still there, though it has been done up a little bit by pennies. And there's some continuity with the jewellers, though hopefully the lockdown won't affect the long-term prospects of the Happy Ring House, which has been in its current site since 1902, and the site of many a happy couple going in to buy their engagement and wedding rings. So what we have now is a rather more elegant street. But this is a COVID photo, so it's not entirely clear that, you know, when we go back to normal, that the traffic won't all arrive out on the street again and clutter it up. Of course, the Spire has replaced Nelson, and there have been efforts to come up with some sort of an integrated plan. In 1998, for instance, the council announced one for the area that was to restore the street to its former status. And some of the developments that were proposed at that stage did take place, but of course then we had a financial crisis and various other things. But the Lewis is an enormous improvement on, actually that doesn't, when I'm looking at it, that's not a COVID photo, it's a pre-COVID because there are no tram lines. But various developments that were promised as a way of restoring some of the tackier end of what was the elegant Upper O'Connell Street, such as the Carlton redevelopment, haven't happened yet for various reasons. And while there's some way towards restoring the coherence and elegance of the earliest incarnation of the street, unfortunately it is still a long way off. So I'll draw a line there, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mary. That was brilliant. We said we'd have time for a few questions, and if participants want to type it into the chat box, is that okay? And I can call them out to Mary.
Okay.
Okay. There's some comments there. Thank you. As an ex-member of Arnott, somebody is interested to know about when will the talks be on Clearys and Arnott's? We have to decide.
We have to decide. I had mentioned today to Fiona, Bernadette's colleague, that the next one will be on Henry Street, so it'll kind of set the scene. But Arnott's and Clearys and Roaches all deserve their own because of the particular history. So maybe I'll do the one after on Arnott's, because it is a talk I developed to be for the 175th anniversary a few years ago, but I just want to update it a little bit in case anything dramatic has happened in the meantime that I missed. So sorry, being long-winded again.
Lots of just comments. Excellent talk. Thanks, Mary. Thank you. Looking forward to the next one. Oh, a question here. When did the Metropole change its design?
The hotel, after it was demolished in 1916 with the bombardment, they restored it to, I remember as a child, kind of playing truant from school and going in to see films with my friends. But it was a lovely, still, not the classical style that had been originally, but still very attractive and mirroring to some extent the original building. But when British Home Stores came in, they just completely demolished the building and replaced it with that modern brutalist effect, monstrosity, if I could. So, but certainly in 1916, there are dramatic pictures from the time that show it almost in rubble.
Okay.
There's virtually nothing left.
And another question here, Mary. What was the date or source for the map, for the first map that you showed at the very start, showing Moore Street, Parnell Street? Great talk, thanks.
Oh, they are, that's from John Roke's 1756 map, I think. Actually, this is where I'm not giving plugs to friends. I don't personally know these people, but Colin Lennon for the Royal Irish Academy has done a lovely collection of pieces broken down by street of Roke's map. I got the images from the archives. I'd used them before, but I would really recommend that book, and you can get it from the Royal Irish Academy, or you can get it from the libraries when they open again. But because there's a lovely discussion about each street and how the history behind it. But the Roke, his map, it's so beautifully clear. It's a lovely piece of work, a piece of cartographic art, I think, and one of the most famous ones of Dublin.
And there's another question.
Can I just ask a question?
Yeah.
Where exactly, Mary, was the medieval part? I worked in Arnott's for 38 years in Boyers, and so I have a huge connection there because I dressed the windows. But the medieval part of the city. What
Well,
street?
it would have been primarily around the river. I mean, what's up at, say, High Street on the south side and St. Audien's Church, that kind of thing, but also coming down Mary's Abbey at the end of Mary Street. Do you know Evans, the art sellers? They're in the top of what's left of Mary's Abbey. A lot of people don't know that in non-COVID times, you can get access to what remains of the Abbey and the little chapel in there. So these are all things, treats we can set up for ourselves for the future.
There was a double basement in Arnott's.
Sorry?
There was a double basement in Arnott's in Henry Street, and also during the Second World War, they had their own book for buying stuff. What was it? Tokens, the Second World War tokens.
For the rations, yeah.
Rations.
Yeah. I mean, Arnott's history is fascinating for lots of reasons, and not least that there's 178 years of it, but, which is always tempting to somebody like me. But yeah, the medieval city really deserves exploration from an expert. I would consider myself a relatively contemporary historian. I've always specialised in the 20th century, and I'm going backwards somewhat, but I would know a great deal more about the more recent times.
Can I ask a question as well, please?
Yeah, you can.
I just want to ask about Mackey's Seeds that used to be in Sackville Street, then O'Connell Street, and then moved to Mary Street.
Yeah,
trading in the city since 1777.
Do you know? I didn't know it was that long.
Yeah.
So there's another one to look up.
Because if you stand on O'Connell Street now and you look across the street at the Gresham Hotel.
Yeah.
To the left of the main entrance where Toddy's Bar is now, if you look up to the second floor, you'll see the M of Mackey's, because it was trading and then it was it suffered in 1916, then was built. And there's very interesting history there.
Well, thank you very much for that. I was going to say, if anybody is interested or is aware of something I should follow up, I'm delighted to get suggestions, but that's really interesting because I had no idea at all. And my mother is an incredibly keen gardener, even still at the age of 92. It saved her sanity, I think, through the lockdown. But she would have been a lifelong devotee of Mackey's. And I've been sent in many a time to buy things for her.
In O'Connell Street also, they were seed merchants. So they were actually, they had farmers' seeds. They weren't just a garden shop.
I have to say, this is where I miss Tom's, because you can trace that sort of thing back.
Yeah.
And not knowing it before, unfortunately, I'll have to wait till I can get back into the archives.
Okay,
to follow
thank you.
it up. But thank you for the information.
Can I ask a question?
You can. There's one other late person ahead, just wanted to know information on the music hall that became the Rotunda, and then yourself.
All right, thank you.
Okay, yeah, well, as you said, it was built as an entertainment place, but that would be what is literally the Rotunda. The hospital itself, the original lying-in hospital, was purpose-built as one of the first lying-in hospitals, as it was called, for pregnant women in Europe at that stage. But I'm having a senior moment now because I'm getting tired, but to remember the exact date. But certainly it would have coincided with the developments around what was originally Rutland Square, now Parnell Square. So we're talking mid to late 18th century. I'm notorious for not remembering dates at the best of times, and if I wasn't specifically looking it up recently, it doesn't stay in my head. But yeah, it's such an amazing building. But so it's now being used for so many different purposes over the years. And I think it's mainly a conference centre attached to the hospital, but then occasionally would be used for large meetings.
And Mr. Quinn, you want to ask
Yeah.
a question?
20 hours.
Yeah, a lot of those buildings which were built in those historic buildings, and they were beautiful buildings too, when they were built back in those years, and Ireland at the time was owned and controlled by the British. Since a lot of Ireland became back in the hands of the Irish state, the ground rent or the land rights underneath those buildings, where could I research where and who owns all that ground rent? I know a lot of it went back to some of the trusts in the UK. Like Prince Charles had a trust there. He owns a lot of that. So you take up and down O'Connell Street, Sackville Street, Henry Street, all that. Some of that might be a 200-year lease, 300-year lease. Where could I get information on that?
You can, well, in normal times, again, you could go to the Registry of Deeds, and if they didn't actually have the records, they would help you. Unfortunately, like everybody else, they're not accessible at the moment, but I suspect you could either phone them or email them. They now have a chief archivist, Ellen Murphy, who what she doesn't know about retrieving old documents is really probably not worth knowing, but she has a terrific staff. So I think if you got onto the Registry of Deeds initially, and if they can't help you, they'll be able to tell you where to go. But I imagine there are significant restrictions on what can be done at the moment because of the lockdown situation. Yeah. But hopefully, you know, that there will be an advisory service even available online.
And Mary, thank you.
Can I just finish?
Sorry, go on ahead.
Can I just, on my question, if one were to buy those ground rents, are they legally entitled to do that? Or do they get to go back to permission from the original owners, which were the old lords?
I'm not an expert in that sort of thing. From my own experience of buying a ground rent, buying an old house, I think it depends on the property, you know, and the terms of the original lease. So I'm not going to say yay or nay either way. I don't know.
I must finish. They are very valuable assets because they're right in the middle of Grove Street, Grafton Street. They are very valuable, you know.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. Mary, one final question. Can anybody give information on Haverty Road, Marino? Haverty Road.
I, off the top of my head, have never heard of it. But I don't know, it might be worth putting in an inquiry to Cormac. It's his area. So you can do that through the commemorations at dublincity.ie. Just send in an email or phone, but there isn't a full-time staff at the moment. People are working from home, so email is generally better.
Can I just say one tiny thing?
Yeah, go on.
The Rotunda Hospital, the Nesbitt family that owned Arnott's, they gave vast amount of money. I mean, vast amount of money to the Rotunda Hospital. What they did was just extraordinary.
There is, there is an archivist in the Rotunda who looks after their archives. And about 10 years ago, I remember meeting her at a conference. So I don't know if it's still the same person there, but she had written a really excellent book about the history of the hospital, which, probably again be worth searching out. But it's these days of no libraries are not just very frustrating for the likes of me. It goes to show you how valuable a library is for everyone's sanity. And thank you to Bernadette and to all of her colleagues who are keeping the Borough Box and other things and other initiatives going.
Thank you. So I suppose